Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Air War podcast presented by Pursuit Picks Media. My name is Mitch and I will be your host on this, hopefully, brand new podcast series that we intend to do for a while because I'm a big fan of World War II airplanes, in case you can't tell, which, by the way, if you're watching the video version of this, I took this picture when I was a sophomore in high school. So that was back in June of 2011. And I'll throw that photo up for you if you're watching the YouTube version of this podcast. But anyways, if you are a World War II airplane nerd like I am, then hopefully our podcast will whet your appetite. I keep saying we because at the time of recording this, my friend Sam Allen, who I do the Pursuit Picks podcast with, and apologies to all of our subscribers, it has been a while since we've done, maybe 8 months since we've done one of those, and we're looking to get back on track with that content, so apologies for that. But anyways, eventually Sam will be joining me for when we dive deeper in talking about Masters of the Air, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And initially, when we came up with this idea, we only wanted to do a podcast series dedicated to Masters of the Air. And then the more I started thinking about it after writing some of the scripted part of this podcast, I was like, why the hell don't we just cover the air war? There's so many stories and so many people and so many places that, you can endlessly find things to talk about. So that's what we're going to do. So this is the Air War podcast. And I figured, well, why not start with a banger of an episode where we're going to be talking about Masters of the Air, the book, the series, and the men. So a quick bit of housekeeping. If you're listening to this on Spotify, check us out on YouTube at Pursuit Picks Media. If you're watching this on YouTube, check this out on Spotify under Pursuit Picks Media. If you are watching the YouTube version of this, I will be sure to throw in some videos and pictures and World War II footage that all pertains to the Air War. So you don't entirely have to look at this because that would get really boring and it wouldn't take long for you to find something else to want to watch. Since we are going to talk about Masters of the Air, I will be going into detail quite a bit about the story of the pilots and the crew. So if you don't want to have any spoilers whatsoever about the series, then you're probably going to want to not listen to this and wait until the series is either has just come out or it's fully out. The first episode airs on January 26th, and the last episode airs on March 15th, I believe. So again, these are all real people, real missions, real events. So it's already out there. This was 80 years ago, so I will be talking about them in extreme detail in some cases. Others not so much. I'll kind of leave some stuff out there for people to pick up on their own when the series comes out. And then as episodes of Masters of the Air are released, we'll do a podcast episode on each one of them and talk about the episode, what we thought. And yeah, I just think it'll be a lot of fun to dive into this. So I'm flying solo for this first episode of the Air War podcast. I kind of started doing this without Sam's knowledge, so that's why you've only got me for this episode, but he should be joining us in the future episodes to come out here in the next few weeks. So we're striving to be an entertaining and informative podcast, and with that, we are undoubtedly going to get things wrong now and then, although we're not trying to. As you can see, I've got a whole frickin' stack of books here, and this was some of my reference material. And so if there is something we miss, or something that we got wrong from our reference material, leave us a comment on YouTube, or send us an email at pursuitpicks@gmail.com, pursuitpicks@gmail.com, because we want to make sure we get this stuff right. And we're not always going to be 100%, although we strive to be. And if you have the correct information when we miss something, please do share it, right? This is what it's all about. We all want to share these stories and get them out there for people to enjoy. And, as you can see, I've got a shitload of books sitting next to me, with the one on top being the heavy hitter. So here we go. Let's go and dive into reference material for this episode. And this is a segment that I think is going to be a norm for the rest of the Air War podcast on down the line. We got to make sure that we point out the heavy hitter. There it is. Oh, let me make sure I can actually show it to you. There we go. Masters of the Air by Donald Miller. America's bomber boys who fought the air war against Nazi Germany. We'll be talking about the book specifically coming up here shortly in the scripted part of the podcast. And that is followed by A Wing and a Prayer by Harry Crosby. Harry Crosby was a navigator with the 100th Bomb Group. So we've got those two. And then we've got Luck of the Draw by Frank Murphy. And I would actually say that the majority, well, my guess, the series isn't out yet, but my guess would be a lot of the source material pertaining to stories of the crew are from these two books right here. Although there is quite a bit on various personnel in Masters of the Air. And I talk a little bit about this in the scripted part of the podcast, where Masters of the Air is not like Band of Brothers, where the book follows one unit from their training through their combat saga to the end of the war. Masters of the Air, the book, is about the entirety of the bombing campaign of America's involvement in Western Europe from 1942 to 1945. So just want to point that out. Okay, so the other heavy hitter. Absolutely love all of his stuff. Roger Freeman, The Mighty Eight. And I have a couple different Roger Freeman books here. The Mighty Eighth being the big one. And then for a lot of statistics that you'll hear in the podcast, I use this book. This is The Mighty Eighth War Diary by Roger Freeman. And I made sure I got the copy that specifically has the 78th Fighter Group, P-47 out of the 78th Fighter Group being my favorite, probably my favorite 8th Air Force unit. And then I have a couple other Roger Freeman books. Oof. Jeez. So we've got The American Airmen in Europe, and this is just a collection of personal accounts from crewmen who served in the 8th Air Force during World War II. Actually, 8th, 9th, 12th, and 15th, so it also covers the Mediterranean theater as well. And the last Roger Freeman one that I've got is Raiding the Reich, the Allied Strategic Bomber Offensive in Europe. And lastly, I just got this book because it's been a while since I've read it. In fact, I want to say it was well over 10 years ago. Well over 10 years ago, because I would have been in high school. This is The Men Who Killed the Luftwaffe by J. Stout. You know, there's just so much to talk about in just that part of the air war, which is Western Europe. And what we want to do in later episodes is expand to as much as we can. So we'll talk about the Eastern Front. We'll talk about the Pacific. We'll talk about one very tiny part of World War II, which I'm really fascinated by, is the Aleutian Islands. So we're hoping to cover all sorts of different topics here on the Air War. But that is the literature reference material that I have. My other sources for this were the American Air Museum website. Absolutely great database. Check that out. And then lastly, I wanted to make sure I put this last, is the 100th Bomb Group Foundation website. Holy cow. That is an absolutely... If you want to find out about the 100th Bomb Group, anything, just go to that website. It's not going to disappoint. And that's all I'm going to say. Other than the website was just recently renovated around the first of the year, I believe. And it's I already liked it to begin with. It had a really good interface. Now it's even better. So go check out the 100th Bomb Group Foundation website. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into the first episode of the Air War Podcast, where we're going to be talking about Masters of the Air, the book, the series, the men. Hope you enjoy. When Donald Miller, who wrote Masters of the Air, was looking for a title, he found it in this passage from a prominent figure among the Allied forces. In the spring of 1944, we were masters in the air. The bitterness of the struggle had thrown a greater strain on the Luftwaffe than it was able to bear. For our air superiority, which by the end of 1944 was to become air supremacy, full tribute must be paid to the United States 8th Air Force. Winston Churchill, closing the ring. Masters of the Air was published in the fall of 2006. I remember reading it when I was in middle school the following year. At that time, my World War II interest was growing greater and greater, particularly in the subtopic of the air war. My dad and uncle recognized this and decided to take it from the level of books and flight simulators to meeting these masters of the air. The Museum of Flight in Seattle, Washington, was headquarters of the American Fighter Aces Association at the time. Throughout the spring and summer, they'd host a panel of 3 to 4 World War II fighter pilots and occasionally bomber crews. Getting to meet the likes of P-51 pilots such as Jim Brooks, Art Jeffrey, and Bud Anderson, the memory of meeting these men, signing photos, and answering questions is a wonderful yet sorrowful one. Nearly all of them are gone now. It is a crossroads that I've been at since becoming an adult in the mid-2010s. Now, 100 years after most of them were born, we will finally have a series that will depict their experiences of a battlefield 5 miles above Earth, where enemy fighters and flak weren't the only thing that could kill them. Most 8th Air Force bomber crews rode into battle with the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Alongside some B-24 Liberator groups in the mighty 8th, these two aircraft went on to become legends while being crewed by legendary men. Their 10-man bomber crews brought the war to Hitler's doorstep. Serving as a pilot or crewman in the 8th Air Force was one of the greatest honors a serviceman could have. It was also one of the deadliest. 26,000 airmen of the mighty 8th lost their lives in the skies over Europe, a loss rate higher than that of the United States Marine Corps during all of World War II. Another 28,000 were captured. Their stories of heroism is second to none, and no shortage of these stories can be found in Miller's book. Knowing that Masters of the Air is the project of Tom Hanks, Steven Spielberg, Playtone, and nearly the same production teams who brought us Band of Brothers and The Pacific, I know as many do, their story is in good hands. Especially considering The Foundation, the book by Donald Miller. The series' screenwriter is none other than John Orloff, who wrote episodes 2 and 9 for Band of Brothers, specifically the D-Day and concentration camp episodes, which you could probably argue that those were probably the two best in that series, although I really like episode 6. Masters of the Air is scheduled to release its first 2 episodes on January 26, 2024 on AppleTV, followed by a weekly episode release that will conclude on March 15th, giving us a total of 9 episodes. Like the book, it appears we will get a multitude of stories and topics. While most of the series will follow the 100th Bomb Group, the trailers show us the 332nd Fighter Group, better known as the Tuskegee Airmen, an all-black, racially segregated fighter unit with the 12th and then later 15th Air Force, who operated out of Ramitelli, Italy. Though they did not fly escort for the 100th, since the 100th Bomb Group was in the 8th Air Force out of England, and the 332nd was with the 15th out of Italy, their paths will cross at Stalag Luft 3, where shot-down Allied airmen were held, and again at Stalag 7A in Moosburg, Germany, where the prisoners were moved to in 1945. One 332nd pilot we will follow is Alexander Jefferson. A quick Google search will entice you to learn more about his story, which is another reason to be excited for Masters of the Air. We will have another podcast episode dedicated to the 332nd Fighter Group, and we'll talk about their role in the air war and outstanding combat record. Viewers of the series will also see the destruction of German cities, as well as reactions from German civilians, the bombing of London, the underappreciated maintenance crews who kept the planes in the air, the psychological toll flying combat missions took on pilots and crew, and many more beyond those few elements that I mentioned. Donald Miller's book follows the entirety of the American bombing campaign against Nazi Germany from 1942 through 1945. There are personal accounts from all sorts of people who were involved in a variety of subjects pertaining to the air war over Western Europe. The birth of the 8th Air Force in Savannah, Georgia, inception of long-range precision bombing, effectiveness of daylight versus nighttime raids, crew training, the dark days of late 1943, Big Week, replacing Ira Eaker with Jimmy Doolittle as commander of the 8th Air Force, the drone attacks of Operation Aphrodite, which is a wild one to read about, the debate of bombing Auschwitz, captured airmen, and many more of a list that is too long to name here. This book is a definitive document amongst scholars. If you want to know what it took, how they did it, and who did it, then you must pick up a copy. While this book doesn't follow the combat saga of a single unit like Stephen Ambrose did with Band of Brothers, it highlights the 100th several times and goes into detail on some of their training, personnel, and missions. The further you read, the more you'll find out about guys like Gail Clevin, John Egan, Robert Rosenthal, Harry Crosby, Chick Harding, John Brady, Frank Murphy, Ken Lemon, Saul Levitt, Everett Blakely, John Kidd, Curtis Biddick, Howard Hambone Hamilton, and lots more guys in the 100th Bomb Group who will undoubtedly be depicted in the miniseries. The book's prologue is appropriately named the Bloody 100th, the unfortunate nickname given to the 100th Heavy Bombardment Group, who was viewed as a hard-luck outfit. Despite their name, the 100th earned a reputation as an excellent unit. They arrived in England during May 1943, stationed at Thorpe Abbotts in East Anglia. East Anglia serving as the area for most American air bases where its farmland was suitable to turn into airfields. During their 22 months on combat operations, from June 1943 through April 1945, the 100th Bomb Group will fly 306 missions and receive 2 Distinguished Unit citations for the Regensburg Raid on August 17, 1943, and the Berlin raids in the first week of March 1944. While they did not suffer the most losses of all 8th Air Force bomb groups, they had at least 8 missions where 7 or more B-17s went down, including one raid over Berlin, where 15 of their flying fortresses were lost. The casualty figures of the 100th Bomb Group are as follows. This is according to the Foundation website. 229 B-17s lost or salvaged, 923 prisoners of war, 757 men killed or missing in action. The 100th Bomb Group will fly in some of the worst daylight bombing missions of the entire war. No doubt we will see this in the series. They were flown by some of the most courageous characters one could ever imagine. This is 4 of the Bomber Boys who will be significant players in the miniseries. Given that the series has yet to be released at the time of this podcast episode, and for the sake of time because, quite frankly, I could talk about this stuff all day, we're focusing on the 4 characters who have top billing, according to the Masters of the Air IMDb. These 4 officers are also heavily featured in the book, and once again, as previously stated, we will follow up with more podcast episodes about the series in the coming weeks. So for now, we're just going to focus on these 4 guys. In the book prologue, we learn about the friendship of John Egan and Gail Clevin. At 27, Egan was the commanding officer of the 418th Bomber Squadron in the 100th Bomb Group, and looked like a character out of a movie. The way he talked is very similar to what you would see in a Damon Runyon play, so if you're familiar with Guys and Dolls. Described as a stick, he was around 140 pounds and sported a pencil-thin mustache, although there are photos of him that show that he grew to extravagant lengths. He could be seen around Thorpe Abbotts wearing a puffy white fleece-lined flying jacket, who claimed, "I could outdrink any of you children," when he was out on the town with his men. On days where he wasn't flying, he'd take a jeep to a nearby pub and sing ballads with the locals till the taps ran dry, or the bartender's patience ran dry. His best friend, Gail Clevin, was the opposite. He often stayed at Thorpe Abbotts during his off time, thinking of Marge, his girl back home waiting for him in Wyoming, whose picture was placed on a small shelf in his tent. Both Egan and Clevin went through flight school together, where they became a pair. It is also where Egan gave him the nickname Buck, because Clevin looked like a kid that Egan knew from his home state of Wisconsin, whose nickname was also Buck. Like Egan, Clevin had a swagger to him with a cocked crusher cap and toothpick in his mouth. Clevin, too, was a squadron commander in the 100th. Both men were part of the original group that arrived in England during May 1943. He was a lean, stoop-shouldered 24-year-old with a heart the size of Texas, as one of his men described. They were the best of friends, and they flew on the toughest missions, including the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid of August 17, 1943, where 60 bombers of the 8th Air Force were shot down, and over 600 men were casualties, killed, wounded, missing, and captured. This mission gave notoriety to Clevin, and you can see a slight preview of it in the official trailer. With how much I've spoiled about the series this far, I will withhold telling you about it and let the series show it. And a quick side note, Clevin's nickname is Buck, and from the research I've gathered, Egan's nickname was Bucky. So if this is included in the series, you can thank me for clarifying who is who. One part in the book that stands out is when Egan is on leave in London. On the morning of October 9th, 1943, while at breakfast, Egan reads the headline in the London Times. 8th Air Force loses 30 fortresses over Bremen. He called Thorpe Abbotts from the first phone he could find, speaking in wartime security. "How did the game go?" Egan asked. The base radio operator replied, "Clevin went down swinging." "Does the team have a game scheduled for tomorrow?" "Yes," said the radio operator. "I want to pitch," replied Egan. As Gale Clevin bailed out of his B-17 on October 8, 1943, he landed through the back door of a house, knocking over furniture and a small stove, and then was immediately captured by the stunned German family. Along with others from the 100th who were shot down that day, they were all taken to Stalag Luft 3, a prisoner of war camp in Poland that housed Allied flyers. Just 2 days later, Egan in the 100th took off to bomb Münster, Germany, wondering if he'd ever see Buck again. He probably didn't realize it would only be a matter of time. Egan's squadron would be hammered by the enemy that day, as 12 of his squadron's 13 aircraft were shot down. Egan bailed out, only to be taken to Stalag Luft 3, where he found his friend Gale Clevin. In the miniseries, Egan is played by Callum Turner, and Clevin is played by Austin Butler. From what I can tell, in the trailers, they've nailed the personalities quite well, and I can't wait to see these two chew up the scenery. I could go into their story more, but I will leave it at that for now, and we'll wait till the series comes out to talk more about Egan and Clevin. However, I will dive deep into the story of my particularly favorite airman from the book, who, again, will be a prominent character in the miniseries, so spoiler alerts. Gale Clevin and John Egan gave the 100th Bomb Group their personality. Bob Rosenthal helped us want to win the war. Harry H. Crosby. A B-17 named Royal Flush was the only plane that came home that day on October 10, 1943 from Egan's squadron. It was piloted by Robert Rosie Rosenthal, a talented football and baseball player of Jewish descent from Brooklyn, and an American who was paying close attention to what was going on in Europe long before the U.S. involvement. Here is Rosenthal in his own words from a passage in the book by Donald Miller. "I'm a Jew, but it wasn't just that. Hitler was a menace to decent people everywhere. I was also tremendously proud of the English. They stood alone against the Nazis during the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. I read the papers avidly for war news and listened to Edward R. Murrow's live radio broadcasts of the bombing of London. I couldn't wait to get over there. When I finally arrived, I thought I was at the center of the world, the place where democracies were gathering to defeat the Nazis. I was right where I wanted to be." Rosenthal arrived at Thorpe Abbotts that August as part of the first replacements in the 100th during the summer of 1943. When he got there, he almost faded into the background. Nobody checked him out in a B-17 as they normally would when replacement pilots and crews arrived. It didn't take Rosie long to notice that the 100th had a discipline problem. After John Egan took him on a formation flight, he was so impressed with Rosenthal that he asked him to fly as his wingman. At the time of the Munster raid, Rosenthal had only flown 2 combat missions since arriving. By the end of that day, his plane was the sole fortress to come home. Upon Rosie's entry to the 100th Bomb Group, 8th Air Force pilots and crews had to complete a tour of 25 combat missions before being rotated home. Of the original crews that arrived at Thorpe Abbotts in May 1943, just 14% reached this number. A broader statistic shines even more light on how the odds were stacked against men like Rosie Rosenthal. By June 6, 1944, 77% of American airmen were casualties. But Rosie Rosenthal beat those odds, and quite handedly. Rosie completed his first tour, then signed up for another. In March 1944, the 8th Air Force raised the mission total to 30, then 4 months later to 35. When Rosie Rosenthal climbed into the cockpit for his last combat mission, he was at number 52. Over the course of his impressive tenure, he rose through the ranks, became a highly respected leader, and one of the most decorated pilots in the Army Air Forces. On September 10, 1944, his B-17 was so badly damaged by flak over Nuremberg that he had to crash land behind friendly lines in northern France, breaking his arm and nose. In February 1945, after hitting their target in Berlin, his B-17 was so shot up to the point where he and his crew had to bail out. With the aircraft ascending and nearing 2,000 feet, Rosie climbed out of the hatch and jumped as the B-17 exploded. He pulled the ripcord and hit the ground so hard that he fractured the same arm he'd broken the prior September. Rosie had landed near the Oder River, where his luck stayed with him. Soviet soldiers scooped him up just minutes later, and he was taken back to Moscow. Eventually, he ended up at Thorpe Abbotts before finally being sent home. But his war wasn't over yet. There was a need for lawyers to prosecute Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg. Already an experienced lawyer who was working at his Manhattan firm, Rosie headed back overseas. During his time as a prosecutor, he met a Navy lawyer by the name of Phyllis Heller, and 1 year later, they were married in Nuremberg. Rosie Rosenthal is played by Nate Mann in the miniseries, and I am undoubtedly looking forward to seeing how he is portrayed. I can't get enough Rosie Rosenthal, so let's hope there's quite a bit of him. Within the Hank Spielberg trilogy of Band of Brothers of the Pacific and now Masters of the Air, there was always at least one serviceman who wrote a masterpiece wartime memoir. In Band of Brothers, it was Parachute Infantry by David Webster, and in the Pacific, it was A Helmet for My Pillow by Bob Leckie, and With the Old Breed at Peleliu in Okinawa by Eugene Sledge. The Masters of the Air contribution to this warrior-turned-writer category is Harry H. Crosby, the 100th Bomb Group navigator who penned the appropriately named A Wing and a Prayer. Upon America's entry into the Second World War, Harry Crosby was in a writing program at the University of Iowa. He dropped out and joined the Army Air Corps in hopes of becoming a pilot. After a few weeks, he failed pilot training and went to navigator school, where he excelled. Crosby ended up flying in the lead B-17 as group navigator on several missions. He was also a rarity amongst the group. Crosby stayed with the 100th during its entire 22-month-long tenure at Thorpe Abbotts. In that time, he flew 32 combat missions, earned a Distinguished Flying Cross, and was promoted to Major. This promotion kept him in England, despite completing his 25-mission tour, which on normal circumstances would have gotten Crosby rotated home. While this was a short summary on Harry Crosby, we will learn more about him in future podcast episodes. One thing I would like to emphasize is that when you read A Wing and a Prayer, you can see in the writing that he was an extremely humble man. To conclude this podcast, I would like to share with you the final page of his book. And before I read, and let me backtrack, I should point out that Crosby is portrayed by Anthony Boyle in the miniseries, and you can hear a few different voiceovers of him, particularly in the teaser trailer. And then in the official trailer, there's a part where he's talking to Rosie Rosenthal in what looks like a barracks. But the one quote that stands out from Crosby in the trailers is, "We came from every corner of the country with a common purpose, to bring the war to Hitler's doorstep." So with that, let's get to A Wing and a Prayer. I have learned to live with ambiguity. I remember the cities we destroyed, and the German poets and inventors we stilled. But I remember the time when we went to the edge, when we put our lives on the line, for a cause that we believed to be just. I remember my friends, those who made it through and those who did not. I remember the tragedies and the horror, but I remember the laughter. I have read many books about the war, trying to get straight on what happened. There are many good ones, especially those by Roger Freeman, Ed Jablonski, Martin Caidin, Ian Hawkins, Richard Lestrange, and Martin Middlebrook. I wonder how they tell the story so well when they weren't there. One of the excellent books, One Last Look, by Rex Allen Smith, has a paragraph I have read and reread. No American or East Anglian can think seriously about B-17s today without feeling the tug of their great purpose and destiny. They were the two-fisted tin cans that tore the roof off a deranged empire. When they swarmed over occupied Europe, people blessed them. One day, when several hundred of them roared across Holland, a little girl cried out in fear. Her father put his arm around her, took her hand, and looked up. "Listen to it, Helene," he told her. "It's the music of angels." Was it worth it? Those years, those lives, that destruction? I still don't know, but I do know that I, too, heard the angels. A Wing and a Prayer by Harry H. Crosby. And with that, let's go ahead and wrap up this very first episode of the Air War Podcast. Again, thank you to everybody for tuning in. I greatly appreciate it. If you found this somewhat interesting, or you're looking for something a whole lot better, I would highly, highly recommend the Mighty Eighth Podcast. It's hosted by, I've got it in my notes here, Johan Tasker and Mike Peters. And I came across this podcast series when I was doing the script for this, and holy crap, it's fantastic. They travel around to various 8th Air Force airfields in East Anglia, and it's just so cool, some of the history that they talk about. And just to hit the highlight for one episode that I was listening to, which I believe was their first episode, they go to Grafton Underwood, which was that was where the first and last 8th Air Force missions of World War II took place. And it's just so cool. They're walking around the airfield and they're talking about various buildings and then guys who were there, missions, all sorts of different missions that they flew. And then they go to Cambridge American Cemetery and they talk about some of the people who are buried there. Just so many interesting different things that they talk about. So I would highly recommend checking those guys out. And once again, that is the Mighty Eighth Podcast, hosted by Johan Tasker and Mike Peters. Let's see. Is there anything else? So other than that, guys, hopefully this left you wanting more of our podcast. Sorry, it's a little sloppy on the first episode presentation. And my hope is that the further we go along, the better this will be. So if you're listening to this on Spotify, go check us out on YouTube at Pursuit Picks Media. If you're listening to this on Spotify, go over to YouTube and check us out at Pursuit Picks Media. Really appreciate it, guys. Again, my name is Mitch Barvich, and we'll catch you next time on the Air War Podcast. Thank you so much.